February 11, 1910. The piccalilli was the lurid color of jaundice. Dr. Fellows ate at the kitchen table by the light of an annoyingly smoky oil lamp. He smeared the piccalilli onto buttered bread, and topped it with a thick slice of fatty ham. He thought of the flitch of bacon resting coolly in his own pantry. He had chosen the pig himself, pointing it out to the farmer, seeing not a living creature but an anatomy lesson, an assembly of loin chops and hock, cheek and belly and huge joints of gammon for boiling. Flesh. He thought of the baby he had rescued from the jaws of death with a snip of his surgical scissors. The miracle of life, he said dispassionately to the rough little Irish maid. Bridget, sir. I am to stay the rest of the night, he added. On account of the snow. He could think of many places he would rather be than Fox Corner. Why was it called that? Why would you celebrate the habitation of such a wily beast? Dr. Fellows had ridden with the hunt, dashing in scarlet, when a young man. He wondered if the girl would skip into his room in the morning with a tray of tea and toast. Imagined her pouring hot water from the jug into the wash-basin, and soaping him down in front of the bedroom fire the way his mother had done, decades ago. Dr. Fellows was obstinately faithful to his wife, but his thoughts roamed far and wide. Bridget led him upstairs with a candle. The candle flared and flickered wildly as he followed the maid's scrawny backside up to a chilly guest room. She lit him his own candle on top of the pot cupboard, and then disappeared into the dark maw of the hall with a hasty, "Good night, sir." He lay in the cold bed, the piccalilli repeating unpleasantly. He wished he was at home, next to the slack, warm body of Mrs. Fellows, a woman to whom nature had denied elegance and who always smelled vaguely of fried onions. Not necessarily a disagreeable thing. War. January 20, 1915, will you get a move on? Bridget said crossly. She was standing impatiently in the doorway, holding Teddy. How many times do I have to tell you, your tea is on the table? Teddy squirmed in the tight brace of her arms. Maurice paid no heed, deeply involved as he was in the intricacies of a Red Indian war dance. Get down from that window, Ursula, for the love of God. And why is it open? It's freezing, you'll catch your death. Ursula had been about to plunge out of the window in Queen Solange's wake, intent on delivering her from the no-man's land of the roof, when something made her hesitate. A little doubt, a faltering foot, and the thought that the roof was very high and the night very wide. And then Pamela had appeared and said, "Mummy says you're to wash your hands for tea," closely followed by Bridget stomping up the stairs with her unyielding refrain, "Your tea's on the table." And all hope of royal rescue was lost. And as for you, Maurice, Bridget continued, you're little more than a savage. I am a savage, he said. I'm an Apache. You could be the king of the Hottentots as far as I'm concerned, but your tea is still on the table. Maurice gave a last defiant battle cry before clattering noisily down the stairs, and Pamela used an old lacrosse net tied onto a walking cane to trawl Queen Solange back from the icy depths of the roof. Tea was a boiled chicken. Teddy had a coddled egg. Sylvie sighed. Many meals involved chickens in one way or another now that they kept their own. They had a henhouse and a wired run on what was to have been an asparagus bed before the war. Old Tom had left them now, although Sylvie heard that Mr. Ridgely still worked for their neighbors, the Coles. Perhaps, after all, he did not like being called Old Tom. This isn't one of our chickens, is it? Ursula asked. No, darling, Sylvie said. It isn't. The chicken was tough and stringy. Mrs. Glover's cooking hadn't been the same since George was injured in a gas attack. He was still in a field hospital in France, and when Sylvie inquired how badly he was injured, she said she didn't know. How awful, Sylvie said. Sylvie thought that if she had a wounded son, far from home, she would have to go on a quest to find him. Nurse and heal her poor boy. Perhaps not Maurice, but Teddy, certainly. The thought of Teddy lying wounded and helpless made her eyes prick with tears. Are you all right, Mummy? Pamela asked. Absolutely, Sylvie said, fishing the wishbone out of the chicken carcass and offering it to Ursula, who said she didn't know how to wish. Well, generally speaking, we wish for our dreams to come true, Sylvie said. But not my dreams. Ursula said, a look of alarm on her face. But not my dreams. Ursula said, thinking of the giant lawnmower that chased her through the night, and the Red Indian tribe that tied her to stakes and surrounded her with bows and arrows. This is one of our chickens, isn't it? Maurice said. Ursula liked the chickens, liked the warm straw and featheriness of the henhouse, liked reaching under the solid warm bodies to find an even warmer egg. It's Henrietta, isn't it? Maurice persisted. She was old. Ready for the pot, Mrs. Glover said. Ursula inspected her plate. She was particularly fond of Henrietta. The tough white slice of meat gave no clues. Henrietta. Pamela squeaked in alarm. Did you kill her? Maurice asked Sylvie eagerly. Was it very bloody? They had already lost several chickens to the foxes. Sylvie said she was surprised at how stupid chickens were. No more stupid than people, Mrs. Glover said. The foxes had taken Pamela's baby rabbit too, last summer. George Glover had rescued two and Pamela had insisted on making a nest for hers out in the garden, but Ursula had rebelled and brought her little rabbit inside, and placed it in the doll's house where it knocked everything over and left droppings like tiny licorice balls. When Bridget discovered it, she removed it to an outhouse, and it was never seen again. For pudding they had jam roly-poly and custard, the jam from the summer's raspberries. The summer was a dream now, Sylvie said. Dead baby, Maurice said, in that horribly offhand manner that boarding school had only served to foster. He shoveled pudding into his mouth and said, that's what we call jam roly-poly at school. Manners, Maurice, Sylvie warned. And please, don't be so vile. Dead baby? Ursula said, putting her spoon down and gazing in horror at the dish in front of her. The Germans eat them, Pamela said gloomily. Puddings? Ursula puzzled. Didn't everyone eat puddings, even the enemy? No, babies, Pamela said. But only Belgian ones. Sylvie looked at the roly-poly, the round, red seam of jam like blood, and shivered. This morning she had watched Mrs. Glover snapping poor old Henrietta's neck backwards over a broom handle, the bird dispatched with the indifference of a state executioner. Needs must, I suppose, Sylvie thought. We're at war, Mrs. Glover said, it's not the time to be squeamish. Pamela would not let the subject rest. Was it, Mummy, she insisted quietly. Was it Henrietta? No, darling, Sylvie said. On my word of honor, that was not Henrietta. An urgent rapping at the back door prevented further discussion. They all sat still, staring at each other, as if they had been caught in the middle of a crime. Ursula didn't really know why. Don't let it be bad news, Sylvie said. It was. Seconds later there was a terrible scream from the kitchen. Sam Wellington, the old boot, was dead. This terrible war, Sylvie murmured. Pamela gave Ursula the remains of one of her dun-colored balls of 4-ply lamb's wool, and Ursula promised that Queen Solange would be delivered of a little mat for Pamela's water glass in gratitude for her rescue. When they went to bed that night they placed the crinoline lady and Queen Solange side by side on the bedside cabinet, valiant survivors of an encounter with the enemy. Armistice. June 1918. Teddy's birthday. Born beneath the sign of the crab. An enigmatic sign, Sylvie said, even though she thought such things were bunkum. For you or for, Bridget said, which was perhaps a kind of joke. Sylvie and Mrs. Glover were preparing a little tea party, a surprise. Sylvie liked all her children, Maurice not so much perhaps, but she doted entirely on Teddy. Teddy didn't even know it was his birthday, as for days now they had been under strict instructions not to mention it. Ursula couldn't believe how difficult it was to keep a secret. Sylvie was an adept. She told them to take the birthday boy out while she got things ready. Pamela complained that she had never had a surprise party, and Sylvie said, "Of course you have, you just don't remember." Was this true? Pamela frowned at the impossibility of knowing. Ursula had no idea whether or not she had ever had a surprise party, or even a party that wasn't a surprise. The past was a jumble in her mind, not the straight line that it was for Pamela. Bridget said, "Come on, we'll all go for a walk," and Sylvie said, "Yes, take some jam to Mrs. Dodds, why don't you?" Sylvie, sleeves rolled up, hair scarved, had spent all day yesterday helping Mrs. Glover make jam, boiling up copper pans of raspberries from the garden with the sugar that they had been hoarding from their ration. "Like working in a munitions factory," Sylvie said, as she funneled the boiling jam into one glass jar after another. "Hardly," Mrs. Glover muttered to herself. The garden had produced a bumper crop. Sylvie had read books on how to cultivate fruit, and declared that she was quite the gardener now. Mrs. Glover said darkly that berries were easy, wait until she tried her hand at cauliflowers. For the heavy work in the garden Sylvie employed Clarence Dodds, once a pal of Sam Wellington's, the old boot. Before the war Clarence had been an undergardener at the hall. He had been invalided out of the army, and now wore a tin mask on half of his face, and said he wanted to work in a grocer's shop. Ursula first came across him when he was preparing a bed for carrots, and she gave an impolite little scream when he turned round and she saw his face for the first time. The mask had one wide open eye painted blue to match the real one. "Enough to frighten the horses, isn't it?" he said and smiled. She wished he hadn't, because his mouth wasn't covered by the mask. His lips were puckered and strange, as if they were an afterthought, stitched on after he was born. "One of the lucky ones," he said to her. "Artillery fire, it's the devil." It didn't look very lucky to Ursula. The carrots had barely sprigged their feathery tops above ground when Bridget started walking out with Clarence. By the time Sylvie was grubbing up the first of the King Edwards, Bridget and Clarence were engaged, and as Clarence couldn't afford a ring, Sylvie gave Bridget a gypsy ring that she said she'd had forever and never wore. "It's just a trinket really," she said, "it's not worth much," although Hugh had bought it for her in New Bond Street after Pamela was born, and had not stinted on the cost. Sam Wellington's photograph was banished to an old wooden crate in the shed. "I can't keep it," Bridget said fretfully to Mrs. Glover, "but I can hardly throw it away, can I now?" "You could bury it," Mrs. Glover suggested, but the idea gave Bridget the shivers. Like black magic. They set off for Mrs. Dodds's house, laden with jam, as well as a magnificent bouquet of maroon sweet peas that Sylvie was very proud of having grown. "The variety is Senator, in case Mrs. Dodds is interested," she told Bridget. "She won't be," Bridget said. Maurice wasn't with them, of course. He had set off on his bicycle after breakfast, a picnic lunch in his knapsack, and had disappeared for the day with his friends. Ursula and Pamela took very little interest in Maurice's life, and he took none whatsoever in theirs. Teddy was a quite different kind of brother, loyal and affectionate as a dog, and petted accordingly. Clarence's mother was still employed at the hall in a semi-feudal capacity, according to Sylvie, and had a cottage on the estate, a cramped, ancient thing that smelt of stale water and old plaster. Distemper on the damp ceiling ballooned like loose skin. Bosun had died of distemper the previous year, and was buried beneath a Bourbon rose that Sylvie had ordered especially to mark his grave. "It's called Louise Odier," she said. "If you're interested." They had another dog now, a wriggly black lurcher puppy called Trixie, who might as well have been called Trouble because Sylvie was always laughing and saying, "Oh, here comes trouble." Pamela had seen Mrs. Glover giving Trixie a well-aimed kick with her big-booted foot, and Sylvie had to have a word. Bridget wouldn't let Trixie come to Mrs. Dodds's house. She said she would never hear the end of it. "She doesn't believe in dogs," Bridget said. "Dogs are hardly an article of faith," Sylvie said. Clarence met them at the entrance gate to the estate. The hall itself was miles away, at the end of a long avenue of elms. The Daunts had lived there for centuries, and popped up occasionally to open fêtes and bazaars, and fleetingly graced the annual Christmas party in the village hall. They had their own chapel, so were never seen in church, although now they were never seen at all because they had lost 3 sons, one after the other, to the war and had more or less retreated from the world. It was impossible not to stare at Clarence's tin face, galvanized copper, he corrected them. They lived in terror that he would remove the mask. Did he take it off to go to bed at night? If Bridget married him, would she see the horror beneath? It's not so much what's there, they had overheard Bridget say to Mrs. Glover, as what's not there. Mrs. Dodds, old Mother Dodds, Bridget called her, like something from a nursery rhyme, made tea for the grown ups, tea that Bridget later reported to be as weak as lamb's water. Bridget liked her tea, strong enough for the teaspoon to stand up in it. Neither Pamela nor Ursula could decide what lamb's water might be, but it sounded nice. Mrs. Dodds gave them creamy milk, ladled from a big enamel pitcher, and still warm from the hall's dairy. It made Ursula feel sick. Lady Bountiful, Mrs. Dodds muttered to Clarence when they handed her the jam, and the sweet peas, and he said, Mother, chidingly. Mrs. Dodds passed the flowers over to Bridget, who remained holding the sweet peas like a bride until Mrs. Dodds said to her, Put them in water, you daft girl. Cake. Clarence's mother said, and doled out thin slices of gingerbread that seemed as damp as her cottage. It's nice to see children, Mrs. Dodds said, looking at Teddy as if he were a rare animal. Teddy was a steadfast little boy and was not put off his milk and cake. He had a mustache of milk and Pamela wiped it off with her handkerchief. Ursula suspected that Mrs. Dodds didn't really think it was nice to see children. Indeed, she suspected that on the subject of children she was in agreement with Mrs. Glover. Except for Teddy, of course. Everyone liked Teddy. Even Maurice. Occasionally. Mrs. Dodds examined the gypsy ring newly adorning Bridget's hand, pulling Bridget's finger towards her as if she was pulling a wishbone. Rubies and diamonds, she said. Very fancy. Tiny stones, Bridget said defensively. Just a trinket, really. The girls helped Bridget wash the tea things, and left Teddy to fend for himself with Mrs. Dodds. They washed up in a big stone sink in the scullery that had a pump instead of a tap. Bridget said that when she was a girl in County Kilkenny, they had to walk to a well to get water. She arranged the sweet peas prettily in an old Dundee marmalade jar, and left it on the wooden draining board. When they had dried the crockery with one of Mrs. Dodds's thin, worn tea towels, damp, of course, Clarence asked them if they would like to go over to the hall to see the walled garden. You should stop going back over there, son, Mrs. Dodds said to him, it only upsets you. They entered via an old wooden door in a wall. The door was stiff and Bridget gave a little scream when Clarence took his shoulder to it and shoved it open. Ursula was expecting something wonderful, sparkling fountains and terraces, statues, walks and arbors and flower beds as far as the eye could see, but it wasn't much more than an overgrown field, brambles and thistles rambling everywhere. Aye, it's a jungle, Clarence said. This used to be the kitchen garden. 12 gardeners worked at the hall before the war. Only the roses climbing on the walls were still flourishing, and the fruit trees in the orchard that were laden with fruit. Plums were rotting on the branches. Excited wasps darted everywhere. They haven't picked this year, Clarence said. 3 sons at the hall, all dead in this bloody war. I suppose they didn't much feel like plum pie. Task, Bridget said. Language. There was a glass house with hardly any glass, and inside it they could see the withered peach and apricot trees. Damned shame, Clarence said, and Bridget tsked again and said, not in front of the children, just like Sylvie did. Everything gone to seed, Clarence said, ignoring her. I could weep. Well, you could get your job back here at the hall, Bridget said. I'm sure they'd be glad. It's not as if you can't work just as well with. She hesitated and gestured vaguely in the direction of Clarence's face. I don't want my job back, he said gruffly. My days as some rich knob's servant are over. I miss the garden, not the life. The garden was a thing of beauty. We could get our own little garden, Bridget said. Or an allotment. Bridget seemed to spend a lot of time trying to cheer Clarence up. Ursula supposed she was rehearsing for marriage. Yes, why don't we do that? Clarence said, sounding grim at the prospect. He picked up a small, sour apple that had fallen early and bowled it hard overarm like a cricketer. It landed on the glasshouse and shattered one of the few remaining panes. Bugger, Clarence said, and Bridget flapped her hand at him and hissed, children. A thing of beauty, Pamela said appreciatively that night, as they flannelled their faces before bed with the heavy bar of carbolic. Clarence is a poet. As they trailed their way home, Ursula could still smell the scent of the sweet peas they had left behind in Mrs. Dodds's kitchen. It seemed an awful waste to leave them there unappreciated. By then, Ursula had forgotten all about the birthday tea, and was almost as surprised as Teddy when they got back to the house and found the hallway decorated with flags and bunting and a beaming Sylvie bearing a gift-wrapped present that was unmistakably a toy aeroplane. Surprise, she said. November 11, 1918, such a melancholy time of year, Sylvie said to no one in particular. The leaves still lay thick on the lawn. The summer was a dream again. Every summer, it was beginning to seem to Ursula was a dream. The last of the leaves were falling and the big beech was almost a skeleton. The armistice seemed to have made Sylvie even more despondent than the war. All those poor boys, gone forever. The peace won't bring them back. They had the day off school because of the great victory, and they were turned outside into the morning drizzle to play. They had new neighbors, Major and Mrs. Shawcross, and they spent a good deal of the damp morning peering through gaps in the holly hedge trying to get a glimpse of the Shawcrosses' daughters. There were no other girls their age in the neighborhood. The Coles only had boys. They weren't rough like Maurice, they had nice manners and were never horrible to Ursula and Pamela. I think they're playing hide-and-seek, Pamela reported back from the Shawcross front. Ursula tried to see through the hedge, and got scratched in the face by the vicious holly. I think they're the same age as us, Pamela said. There's even a little one for you, Teddy. Teddy raised his eyebrows and said, oh. Teddy liked girls. Girls liked Teddy. Oh wait, there's another one, Pamela said. They're multiplying. Bigger or smaller? Ursula asked. Smaller, another girl. More of a baby. Being carried by an older one. Ursula was growing confused by the mathematics of so many girls. 5. Pamela said breathlessly, reaching a final total apparently. 5 girls. By this time Trixie had managed to wriggle through the bottom of the hedge, and they heard the excited squeals that accompanied her appearance on the other side of the holly. I say, Pamela said, raising her voice, can we have our dog back? Lunch was boiled toad in the hole, and a queen of puddings. Where have you been? Sylvie asked. Ursula, you have twigs in your hair. You look like a pagan. Holly, Pamela said. We've been next door. We met the Shawcross girls. 5 of them. I know. Sylvie counted them off on her fingers. Winnie, Gertie, Millie, Nancy and Beatrice, Pamela supplied. Were you invited in? Mrs. Glover, a stickler for propriety, asked. We found a hole in the hedge, Pamela said. That's where those damn foxes are getting through, Mrs. Glover grumbled, they're coming from the copse, and Sylvie frowned at Mrs. Glover's language but said nothing as, officially, they were in celebration mood. Sylvie, Bridget and Mrs. Glover were toasting the peace with glasses of sherry. Neither Sylvie nor Mrs. Glover seemed to have much of a taste for jubilation. Both Hugh and Izzy were still away at the front, and Sylvie said she wouldn't believe Hugh was safe until he walked through the door. Izzy had driven an ambulance throughout the war, but none of them could imagine this. George Glover was being rehabilitated in a home somewhere in the Cotswolds. Mrs. Glover had traveled to visit him, but was disinclined to talk about what she had found, other than to say that George was no longer really George. I don't think any of them are themselves anymore, Sylvie said. Ursula tried to imagine not being Ursula, but was defeated by the impossibility of the task. 2 girls from the Women's Land Army had taken George's place on the farm. They were both horsey types from Northamptonshire, and Sylvie said that if she'd known they were going to let women work with Samson and Nelson, she would have applied for the job herself. The girls had come to tea on several occasions, sitting in the kitchen in their muddy puttees, to Mrs. Glover's disgust. Bridget had her hat on ready to go out when Clarence appeared shyly at the back door, mumbling a greeting to Sylvie and Mrs. Glover. The happy couple, as Mrs. Glover referred to them without any hint of congratulation, were catching the train up to London to take part in the victory celebrations. Bridget was giddy with excitement. "Sure now you don't want to come with us, Mrs. Glover? I'll bet there'll be some high jinks to be had." Mrs. Glover rolled her eyes like a discontented cow. She was avoiding crowds on account of the influenza epidemic. She had a nephew who had dropped dead in the street, perfectly healthy at breakfast, and dead by noon. Sylvie said they mustn't be scared of the influenza. "Life must go on," she said. After Bridget and Clarence left for the station, Mrs. Glover and Sylvie sat at the kitchen table and drank another sherry. "High jinks, indeed," Mrs. Glover said. By the time Teddy appeared, Trixie eager on his tail, and announced that he was starving, and had they forgotten lunch, the meringue on top of the Queen of Puddings had collapsed and was all burnt. The final casualty of the war. They had tried and failed to stay awake for Bridget's return, falling asleep over their bedtime reading. Pamela was in the spell of At the Back of the North Wind while Ursula was working her way through The Wind in the Willows. She was particularly fond of Mole. She was a mysteriously slow reader and writer, practice makes perfect, dear, and liked it best when Pamela read out loud to her. They both liked fairy stories and had all of the Andrew Lang books, all 12 colors, bought by Hugh for birthdays and Christmases. "Things of beauty," Pamela said. Bridget's noisy return woke Ursula, and she, in turn, roused Pamela, and they both tiptoed downstairs where a merry Bridget and a more sober Clarence regaled them with tales of the festivities, of the sea of people, and of the gay crowd shouting themselves hoarse for the king. "We want the king. We want the king," Bridget demonstrated enthusiastically, until he appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. "And the bells," Clarence added, "never heard anything like it. All the bells of London ringing out the peace." "A thing of beauty," Pamela said. Bridget had lost her hat somewhere amid the throng, as well as several hairpins and the top button of her blouse. "Lifted off my feet in the crush," she said happily. "Goodness, what a racket," Sylvie said, appearing in the kitchen, sleepy and lovely in her lacy wrap, her hair in a great fraying rope down her back. Clarence blushed and looked at his boots. Sylvie made cocoa for them all and listened indulgently to Bridget, until even the novelty of being up at midnight couldn't keep any of them awake. "Back to normal tomorrow," Clarence said, giving Bridget a daring peck on the cheek before making his way back to his mother. It was, altogether, a day out of the ordinary. "Do you think Mrs. Glover will be cross that we didn't wake her?" Sylvie whispered to Pamela on the way up the stairs. "Furious," Pamela said, and they both laughed like conspirators, like women. When she fell asleep again, Ursula dreamed of Clarence and Bridget. They were walking in an overgrown garden, looking for Bridget's hat. Clarence was crying, real tears on the good side of his face, while on the mask there were painted tears, like artificial raindrops on a picture of a window pane. When Ursula woke up the next morning, she was burning hot and aching all over and boiling, like a lobster, Mrs. Glover said, brought in for a second opinion by Sylvie. Bridget was also laid up in bed. "Hardly surprising," Mrs. Glover said, folding disapproving arms beneath her ample yet uninviting bosom. Ursula hoped she would never have to be nursed by Mrs. Glover. Ursula's breathing was harsh and raspy, her breath thickening in her chest. The world boomed and receded like the sea in a giant shell. Everything was rather pleasantly fuzzy. Trixie lay on the bed at her feet while Pamela read to her from the red fairy book, but the words came and went meaninglessly. Pamela's face loomed in and out of focus. Sylvie came and tried to feed her beef tea, but her throat felt too small, and she sputtered it out, all over the bed sheets. There was the sound of tires on gravel, and Sylvie said to Pamela, "That will be Dr. Fellows," and rose swiftly, adding, "Stay with Ursula, Pammy, but don't let Teddy in here, will you?" The house was more silent than usual. When Sylvie didn't come back, Pamela said, "I'll go and look for Mummy. I won't be long." Ursula heard murmurings and cries drifting from somewhere in the house, but they meant nothing to her. She was sleeping a strange restless kind of sleep, when Dr. Fellows appeared suddenly by the side of the bed. Sylvie sat on the other side of the bed and held Ursula's hand, saying, "Her skin is lilac. Like Bridget's." Lilac skin sounded rather nice, like the Lilac Fairy book. Sylvie's voice seemed funny, choked up and panicked like the time she saw the telegram boy coming up the path, but it turned out to be only a telegram from Izzy wishing Teddy a happy birthday. "Thoughtless," Sylvie said. Ursula couldn't breathe, and yet she could smell her mother's perfume, and hear her voice murmuring gently in her ear like a bee buzz on a summer's day. She was too tired to open her eyes. She heard Sylvie's skirts rustle as she left her bedside, followed by the sound of the window opening. "I'm trying to get you some air," Sylvie said, returning to Ursula's side, and holding her against her crisp seersucker blouse with its safe scents of laundry starch and roses. The woody fragrance of bonfire smoke drifted through the window, and into the little attic room. She could hear the clopping of hooves followed by the rattle of the coal, as the coalman emptied his sacks into the coal shed. Life was going on. A thing of beauty. One breath, that was all she needed, but it wouldn't come. Darkness fell swiftly, at first an enemy, but then a friend. Snow. February 11, 1910. A big woman with the forearms of a stoker woke Dr. Fellows by clattering a cup and saucer down on the pot table next to his bed, and yanking open the curtains even though it was still dark outside. It took him a moment to remember that he was in the freezing cold guest bedroom at Fox Corner, and that the rather intimidating woman bearing the cup and saucer was the Todd's cook. Dr. Fellows searched the dusty archive of his brain for a name that he knew had come to him easily a few hours earlier. "It's Mrs. Glover," she said, as if reading his mind. "So it is. She of the excellent pickles." His head felt full of straw. He was uncomfortably aware that beneath the frugal covers he was wearing only his combinations. The bedroom grate, he noted, was cold and empty. "You're needed," Mrs. Glover said. "There's been an accident." "An accident?" Dr. Fellows echoed. "Something has happened to the baby. A farmer trampled by a bull." Armistice. November 12, 1918. Ursula woke up with a start. It was dark in the bedroom, but she could hear noises somewhere downstairs. A door closing, giggling and shuffling. She caught the high-pitched cackle that was Bridget's unmistakable laugh, and the rumbling bass note of a man. Bridget and Clarence back from London. Ursula's first instinct was to clamber out of bed and shake Pamela awake, so that they could go downstairs and interrogate Bridget about the high jinks, but something stopped her. As she lay listening to the dark, a wave of something horrible washed over her, a great dread, as if something truly treacherous were about to happen. The same feeling she had had when she'd followed Pamela into the sea, when they were on holiday in Cornwall, just before the war. They had been rescued by a stranger. After that, Sylvie made sure they all went to the swimming baths in town, and took lessons, from an ex-major in the Boer War who barked orders at them until they were too frightened to sink. Sylvie often retold the tale, as if it were a hilarious escapade, the heroic Mr. Winton, when in fact Ursula still clearly recalled the terror. Pamela mumbled something in her sleep, and Ursula said, "SSH, Pamela mustn't wake up. They mustn't go downstairs. They mustn't see Bridget." Ursula didn't know why this was so, where this awful sense of dread came from, but she pulled the blankets over her head to hide from whatever was out there. She hoped it was out there and not inside her. She thought she would feign sleep, but within minutes the real thing came. In the morning they ate in the kitchen because Bridget was in bed, feeling ill. Hardly surprising, Mrs. Glover said unsympathetically, doling out porridge. I dread to think what time she staggered in. Sylvie came down from upstairs with a tray that hadn't been touched. I really don't think Bridget is well, Mrs. Glover, she said. Too much drink, Mrs. Glover scoffed, cracking eggs as if she were punishing them. Ursula coughed and Sylvie glanced sharply at her. I think we should call Dr. Fellows out, Sylvie said to Mrs. Glover. For Bridget. Mrs. Glover said. The girl's as healthy as a horse. Dr. Fellows will give you short shrift when he smells the alcohol on her. Mrs. Glover, Sylvie said in the tone she used when she was being very serious about something, and wanted to make sure people were listening, don't trail muddy footprints into the house, never be unkind to other children, no matter how provoking they are. I really do think Bridget is ill. Mrs. Glover seemed suddenly to understand. Can you see to the children? Sylvie said. I am going to telephone for Dr. Fellows, and then I'll go up and sit with Bridget. Aren't the children going to school? Mrs. Glover asked. Yes, of course they are, Sylvie said. Although perhaps not. No, yes, they are. Or should they? She hovered, fretfully indecisive, in the kitchen doorway while Mrs. Glover waited with surprising patience for her to come to a conclusion. I think keep them at home, for today, Sylvie said finally. Crowded schoolrooms and so on. She took a deep breath and stared at the ceiling. But keep them down here, just now. Pamela raised her eyebrows at Ursula. Ursula raised hers back, although she wasn't sure what they were trying to communicate to each other. Horror mainly, she supposed, at being put in Mrs. Glover's care. They had to sit at the kitchen table so Mrs. Glover could keep an eye on them, and then, despite their violent protests, she bade them get out their schoolbooks and do work, sums for Pamela, letters for Teddy, Q's for Quail, R's for Rain, and Ursula was set to practice her atrocious handwriting. Ursula thought it vastly unfair that someone who wrote nothing more than shopping lists in a blunt hand is suet, stove blacking, mutton chops and Dinaford's magnesia, should be passing judgment on her own painful script. Mrs. Glover meanwhile was more than fully occupied with pressing a calf's tongue, removing the gristle and bone and rolling it up before squeezing it into the tongue press, an altogether more fascinating activity to observe than writing out quick wafting Zephyr's Vex Bold Jim, or the 5 boxing wizards jumped quickly. I would hate to be in any school where she was mistress, Pamela muttered, wrestling with equations. They were all distracted by the advent of the butcher's boy, ringing his bicycle bell noisily to announce his arrival. He was a 14-year-old called Fred Smith whom both the girls and Maurice admired tremendously. The girls signaled their ardor by calling him Freddie, while Maurice called him Smithy, in comradely approval. Pamela had once declared that Maurice had a pash on Fred, and Mrs. Glover, who happened to hear, slapped Pamela in passing on the back of her legs with a balloon whisk. Pamela was very put out, and had no idea what she had been punished for. Fred Smith himself addressed the girls deferentially as Miss and Maurice as Master Todd, although he took no interest in any of them. To Mrs. Glover he was young Fred, and to Sylvie he was the butcher's boy, sometimes, that nice butcher's boy to distinguish him from the previous butcher's boy, Leonard Ashe, a sneaky rogue, according to Mrs. Glover, who had caught him stealing eggs from the henhouse. Leonard Ashe died in the Battle of the Somme after lying about his age, when he enlisted, and Mrs. Glover said he got what was coming to him, which seemed a rough kind of justice. Fred handed over a white paper package to Mrs. Glover and said, "Your tripe," and then deposited the long soft body of a hare on the wooden draining board. Hung for 5 days. It's a beauty, Mrs. Glover, and even Mrs. Glover, disinclined to praise in the best of circumstances, acknowledged the hare's superiority by opening a cake tin, and allowing Fred to choose the biggest rock bun from within its usually clam-like innards. Mrs. Glover, her tongue now safely in the press, immediately began skinning the hare, a distressing yet hypnotic process to witness, and it was only when the poor creature was stripped of its fur and exposed, naked and shiny, that anyone noticed Teddy's absence. "Go and fetch him," Mrs. Glover said to Ursula. "And you can all have a glass of milk and a rock bun," although goodness knows you've done nothing to deserve it. Teddy was fond of hide-and-seek, and when he didn't respond to his name being called, Ursula looked in his secret places, behind the drawing-room curtains, beneath the dining-room table, and when she could find no sign of him she set off up the stairs to the bedrooms. A forceful clanging of the front door bell echoed up the stairs in her wake. From the turn in the stairs she saw Sylvie appear in the hallway, and open the door to Dr. Fellows. Ursula supposed her mother must have come down the back stairs rather than appearing by magic. Dr. Fellows and Sylvie engaged in an intense, whispered conversation, about Bridget, presumably, but Ursula couldn't catch any of the words. Not in Sylvie's room, they had long ago ceased to think of it as a room that belonged to two parents. Not in Morris's room, so generously sized for someone who spent more than half his life living at school. Not in the guest bedroom or the second guest bedroom, nor in Teddy's own little back bedroom that was almost entirely taken up with his train set. Not in the bathroom or the linen cupboard. Nor was there any sign of Teddy under the beds or in the wardrobes or in the many cupboards, nor, his favorite trick, as still as a corpse beneath Sylvie's big eiderdown. "There's cake downstairs, Teddy," she offered up to the empty rooms. The promise of cake, true or not, was normally enough to flush Teddy out from cover. Ursula trudged up the dark narrow wooden staircase that led to the attic bedrooms, and as soon as she had placed her foot on the first tread she experienced a sudden pinch of fear in her insides. She had no idea where it came from, or why. "Teddy! Teddy, where are you?" Ursula tried to raise her voice, but the words came out in a whisper. Not in the bedroom she shared with Pamela, not in Mrs. Glover's old room. Not in the box room, once a nursery, and now home to chests and trunks and packing cases of old clothes and toys. Only Bridget's room remained unexplored. The door was ajar and Ursula had to force her feet to walk towards it. Something terrible was beyond that open door. She didn't want to see it, but she knew she must. "Teddy," she said, overcome with relief at the sight of him. Teddy was sitting on Bridget's bed, his birthday aeroplane on his knee. "I've been looking everywhere for you," Ursula said. Trixie was lying on the floor next to the bed and sprang up eagerly when she saw her. "I thought it might make Bridget feel better," Teddy said, stroking the plane. Teddy had great faith in the healing power of toy trains and aeroplanes. He was, he assured them, going to be a pilot when he grew up. "I think Bridget's asleep but her eyes are open," he said. They were wide open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. There was a watery blue film across those disturbing eyes, and her skin had a strange lilac hue. Cobalt violet in Ursula's Winsor and Newton watercolor set. She could see the tip of Bridget's tongue sticking out of her mouth, and had a momentary vision of Mrs. Glover pushing the calf's tongue into the press. Ursula had never seen a dead body, but she knew without any doubt that Bridget had now become one. "Get off the bed, Teddy," she said cautiously, as if her brother were a wild creature about to bolt. She started to tremble all over. It wasn't just that Bridget was dead, although that was bad enough, but there was something more perilous here. The unadorned walls, the thin jacquard bedspread on the iron bedstead, the enameled brush and comb set on the dressing table, the rag rug on the floor, all suddenly grew immensely threatening, as if they were not really the objects they seemed. Ursula heard Sylvie and Dr. Fellows on the stairs. Sylvie's tones were urgent, Dr. Fellows's less concerned. Sylvie came in and gasped, "Oh dear God," when she saw them in Bridget's room. She snatched Teddy off the bed and then pulled Ursula by the arm out into the passage. Trixie, tail wagging eagerly at the excitement, bounded after them. "Go to your room," Sylvie said. "No, go to Teddy's room." "No, go to my room." "Go now," she said, sounding frantic, not at all the Sylvie they were used to. Sylvie went back into Bridget's room, and closed the door decisively. They could hear only murmured exchanges between Sylvie and Dr. Fellows, and eventually Ursula said, "Come on," to Teddy and took his hand. He allowed her to lead him docilely back down the stairs to Sylvie's bedroom. "Did you say cake?" he asked. "Teddy's skin is the same color as Bridget's," Sylvie said. Her stomach hollowed out with terror. She knew what she was looking at. Ursula was merely pale, although her closed eyelids were dark and her skin glistened with a strange, sickly sheen. Heliotrope cyanosis, Dr. Fellows said, taking Teddy's pulse. And see those mahogany spots on his cheeks. This is the more virulent strain, I'm afraid. Stop, please stop, Sylvie hissed. Do not lecture me like a medical student. I am their mother. How she hated Dr. Fellows at that moment. Bridget was lying in her bed upstairs, still warm, but as dead as the marble on a tomb. The influenza, Dr. Fellows continued relentlessly. Your maid was mixing with crowds of people yesterday in London, perfect conditions for the infection to spread. It can take them in the blink of an eye. But not this one, Sylvie said fiercely, clutching Teddy's hand. Not my child. Not my children, she amended, reaching across to stroke Ursula's burning forehead. Pamela hovered in the doorway and Sylvie shooed her away. Pamela started to cry, but Sylvie had no time for tears. Not now, not in the face of death. There must be something I can do, she said to Dr. Fellows. You can pray. Pray. Sylvie did not believe in God. She considered the biblical deity to be an absurd, vengeful figure, Tiffin and so on, no more real than Zeus or the great god Pan. She went to church dutifully every Sunday, however, and avoided alarming Hugh with her heretical thoughts. Needs must, and so on. She prayed now, with desperate conviction but no faith, and she suspected it made no difference either way. When a pale bloody kind of froth, like cuckoo spit, bubbled from Teddy's nostrils, Sylvie made a noise like a wounded animal. Mrs. Glover and Pamela were listening at the other side of the door, and in a rare moment of unity they clutched each other's hands. Sylvie snatched Teddy from the bed, and held him tightly to her breast and howled with pain. Dear God, Dr. Fellows thought, the woman grieved like a savage. They sweated together in a tangle of Sylvie's linen bed sheets. Teddy was spread-eagled across the pillows. Ursula wanted to hold him close, but he was too hot, so she held one of his ankles instead, as if she was trying to stop him running away. Ursula's lungs felt as if they were full of custard, she imagined it thick and yellow and sweet. Teddy was gone by nightfall. Ursula knew the moment he died, she felt it inside her. She heard just one wretched moan from Sylvie, and then someone lifted Teddy out of the bed, and even though he was just a little boy, it was as if something weighty had gone from her side, and Ursula was alone in the bed. She could hear Sylvie's choking sobs, an awful noise, as if someone had hacked off one of her limbs. Every breath squeezed the custard stuff in her lungs. The world was fading and she began to have a stirring sense of anticipation, as if it were Christmas or her birthday, and then the black bat night approached and enfolded her in his wings. One last breath and then no more. She held out a hand to Teddy, forgetting that he wasn't there anymore. Darkness fell. Snow. February 11, 1910. Sylvie lit a candle. Winter dark, 5 o'clock in the morning by the little gold carriage clock on the bedroom mantelpiece. The clock, an English one, better than a French one, her mother had instructed, had been one of her parents' wedding presents. When the creditors came to call after the society portraitist's death, his widow hid the clock beneath her skirts, bemoaning the passing of the crinoline. Lottie appeared to chime on the quarter, disconcerting the creditors. Luckily they were not in the room when she struck the hour. The new baby was asleep in her cradle. Words from Coleridge suddenly came into Sylvie's mind. Dear babe, that sleepest cradled by my side. Which poem was that? The fire in the grate had died down, leaving only the smallest flame still dancing on the coals. The baby began to make mewling sounds and Sylvie climbed gingerly out of bed. Childbirth was a brutal affair. If she had been in charge of designing the human race, she would have gone about things quite differently. A golden shaft of light through the ear for conception perhaps, and a well-fitting hatch somewhere modest for escape 9 months later. She left the warmth of her bed and retrieved Ursula from the cradle. And then, suddenly, breaking the snow-muffled silence, She thought she heard the soft nicker of a horse, and felt a little buzz of electric pleasure in her soul at this unlikely sound. She carried Ursula over to the window, and drew one of the heavy curtains back far enough to see out. The snow had obliterated everything familiar, the world outside was shawled in white. And there below was the fantastic sight of George Glover riding bareback on one of his great shires, Nelson, if she wasn't mistaken, up the wintry drive. He looked magnificent, like a hero of old. Sylvie closed the curtains and decided that the tribulations of the night had probably affected her brain, and were making her hallucinate. She took Ursula back into bed with her, and the baby rooted around for her nipple. Sylvie believed in wet nursing her own children. The idea of glass bottles and rubber teats seemed unnatural somehow, but that didn't mean that she didn't feel like a cow being milked. The baby was slow and floundering, confounded by the new. How long before breakfast, Sylvie wondered. Armistice. November 11, 1918. Dear Bridget, I have locked and bolted the doors. There is a gang of thieves, should the I come before the E. Ursula chewed the end of her pencil until it splintered. Undecided, she crossed out thieves and wrote robbers instead. There is a gang of robbers in the village. Please can you stay with Clarence's mother? For good measure she added, and also I have a headache, so don't knock. She signed it Mrs. Todd. Ursula waited until there was no one in the kitchen, and then went outside and pinned the note to the back door. What are you doing? Mrs. Glover asked as she came back inside. Ursula jumped. Mrs. Glover could move as quietly as a cat. Nothing, Ursula said, looking to see if Bridget was coming yet. Heavens, Mrs. Glover said, she'll be back on the last train, not for hours yet. Now shift yourself, it's long past your bedtime. It's Liberty Hall here. Ursula didn't know what Liberty Hall meant, but it sounded like rather a good place to live. Next morning there was no Bridget in the house. Nor, more puzzlingly, was there any sign of Pamela. Ursula felt overwhelmed by relief as inexplicable as the panic that had led her to write the note the previous night. There was a silly note on the door last night, a prank, Sylvie said. Bridget was locked out. You know, it looks just like your handwriting, Ursula. I don't suppose you can explain that. No, I can't, Ursula said stoutly. I sent Pamela to Mrs. Dodd's to fetch Bridget home, Sylvie said. You sent Pamela? Ursula echoed in horror. Yes, Pamela. Pamela is with Bridget. Yes, Sylvie said. Bridget. What is the matter with you? Ursula ran out of the house. She could hear Sylvie shouting after her, but she didn't stop. She had never run so fast in all of her 8 years, not even when Maurice was chasing her to give her a Chinese burn. She ran up the lane in the direction of Mrs. Dodds's cottage, splashing through the mud so that by the time Pamela and Bridget were in sight ahead of her she was filthy from head to toe. What is the matter? Pamela asked anxiously. Is it Daddy? Bridget made the sign of the cross. Ursula threw her arms round Pamela and collapsed in tears. Whatever is it? Tell me, Pamela said, caught up now in the dread. I don't know, Ursula sobbed. I just felt so worried about you. What a goose, Pamela said affectionately, hugging her. I have a bit of a headache, Bridget said. Let's get back to the house. Darkness soon fell again. Snow. February 11, 1910. A miracle, says the fellow's feller, Bridget said to Mrs. Glover as they toasted the new baby's arrival over their morning teapot. As far as Mrs. Glover was concerned, miracles belonged inside the pages of the Bible, not amid the carnage of birth. Maybe she'll stop at 3, she said. Now why would she be going and doing that when she has such lovely healthy babies, and there's enough money in the house for anything they want? Mrs. Glover, ignoring the argument, heaved herself up from the table and said, well, I must get on with Mrs. Todd's breakfast. She took a bowl of kidneys soaking in milk from the pantry, and commenced removing the fatty white membrane like a caul. Bridget glanced at the milk, white marbled with red, and felt uncharacteristically squeamish. Dr. Fellows had already breakfasted on bacon, black pudding, fried bread and eggs, and left. Men from the village had arrived and tried to dig his car out, and when that had failed someone ran for George, and he had come to the rescue, riding on the back of one of his big shires. St. George slipped briefly into Mrs. Glover's mind and hastily slipped out again as being too fanciful. With not inconsiderable difficulty, Dr. Fellows was hoisted up behind Mrs. Glover's son, and the pair had ridden off, plowing snow, not earth. A farmer had been trampled by a bull, but was alive still. Mrs. Glover's own father, a dairyman, had been killed by a cow. Mrs. Glover, young but dowdy and not yet acquainted with Mr. Glover, had come across her father lying dead in the milking shed. She could still see the blood on the straw and the surprised look on the face of the cow, her father's favorite, Maisie. Bridget warmed her hands on the teapot and Mrs. Glover said, "Well, I'd better to see to my kidneys. Find me a flower for Mrs. Todd's breakfast tray." A flower? Bridget puzzled, looking through the window at the snow. In this weather? Armistice. November 11, 1918. "Oh, Clarence," Sylvie said, opening the back door. "Bridget's had a bit of an accident, I'm afraid. She tripped and fell over the step. Just a sprained ankle, I think, but I doubt that she'll be able to go up to London for the celebrations." Bridget was sipping a brandy, sitting in Mrs. Glover's chair, a big high-backed Windsor, by the stove. Her ankle was propped up on a stool, and she was enjoying the drama of her tale. "I was just coming in the kitchen door, so I was. I'd been hanging out washing, although I don't know why I bothered, because it started to rain again, when I felt hands shoving me in the back. And then there I was, sprawled all over the ground in agony. Small hands," she added. "Like the hands of a little ghost child." "Oh, really?" Sylvie said. "There are no ghosts in this house, children or otherwise. Did you see anything, Ursula? You were in the garden, weren't you?" "Oh, the silly girl just tripped," Mrs. Glover said. "You know how clumsy she is." "Well, anyway," she said with some satisfaction, "that's put paid to your London high jinks." "Not so," Bridget said stoutly. "I'm not missing this day for anything. Come on, Clarence. Give me your arm. I can hobble." Darkness and so on. Snow. February 11, 1910. "Ursula, before you ask," Mrs. Glover said, dumping spoonfuls of porridge into bowls in front of Maurice and Pamela, who were sitting at the big wooden table in the kitchen. "Ursula," Bridget said appreciatively. "That's a good name. Did she like the snowdrop?" Armistice. November 11, 1918. Everything familiar somehow. "It's called déjà vu," Sylvie said. "It's a trick of the mind. The mind is a fathomless mystery." Ursula was sure that she could recall lying in the baby carriage beneath the tree. "No," Sylvie said, "no one can remember being so small," yet Ursula remembered the leaves, like great green hands, waving in the breeze, and the silver hair that hung from the carriage hood, turning and twisting in front of her face. Sylvie sighed. "You do have a very vivid imagination, Ursula." Ursula didn't know whether this was a compliment or not, but it was certainly true that she often felt confused between what was real and what was not. And the terrible fear, fearful terror, that she carried around inside her. The dark landscape within. "Don't dwell on such things," Sylvie said sharply when Ursula tried to explain. "Think sunny thoughts." And sometimes, too, she knew what someone was about to say before they said it, or what mundane incident was about to occur, if a dish was about to be dropped or an apple thrown through a glasshouse, as if these things had happened many times before. Words and phrases echoed themselves, strangers seemed like old acquaintances. "Everyone feels peculiar from time to time," Sylvie said. "Remember, dear, sunny thoughts." Bridget lent a more willing ear, declaring that Ursula had the second sight. There were doorways between this world and the next, she said, but only certain people could pass through them. Ursula didn't think that she wanted to be one of those people. Last Christmas morning, Sylvie had handed Ursula a box, nicely wrapped and ribboned, the contents quite invisible, and said, "Happy Christmas, dear," and Ursula said, "Oh good, a dining set for the doll's house," and was immediately in trouble for having sneaked a preview of the presents. But I never, she insisted obstinately to Bridget later in the kitchen, where Bridget was trying to affix little white paper crowns on the footless legs of the Christmas goose. The goose made Ursula think of a man in the village, a boy really, who had had both his feet blown off at Cambrai. "I didn't look, I just knew." "Ah, I know," Bridget said. "For sure, you have the sixth sense." Mrs. Glover, wrestling with the plum pudding, snorted her disapproval. She was of the opinion that 5 senses were too many, let alone adding on another one. They were shut out in the garden for the morning. "So much for victory celebrations," Pamela said as they sheltered from the drizzle beneath the beech tree. Only Trixie was having a good time. She loved the garden, mainly because of the number of rabbits which, despite the best attentions of the foxes, continued to enjoy all the benefits of the vegetable garden. George Glover had given 2 babies to Ursula and Pamela before the war. Ursula convinced Pamela that they had to keep them indoors, and they hid them in their bedroom cupboard and fed them with an eyedropper they found in the medicine cabinet, until they hopped out one day and frightened Bridget out of her wits. "A fait accompli," Sylvie said when she was presented with the rabbits. "You can't keep them in the house though. You'll have to ask old Tom to build a hutch for them." The rabbits had escaped long ago, of course, and had multiplied happily. Old Tom had laid down poison and traps to little avail. "Goodness," Sylvie said, looking out one morning at the rabbits contentedly breakfasting on the lawn. "It's like Australia out there." Maurice, who was learning to shoot in the junior ATC at school, had spent all of last summer's long holiday taking potshots at them from his bedroom window with Hugh's neglected old Wesley Richards wildfowler. Pamela was so furious with him that she put some of his own itching powder, he was forever in joke shops, in his bed. Ursula immediately got the blame and Pamela had to own up, even though Ursula had been quite ready to take it on the chin. That was the kind of person Pamela was, always very stuck on being fair. They heard voices in the garden next door, they had new neighbors they were yet to meet, the Shawcrosses, and Pamela said, "Come on, let's go and see if we can catch a look. I wonder what they're called." Winnie, Gertie, Millie, Nancy and baby Bea, Ursula thought but said nothing. She was getting as good at keeping secrets as Sylvie. Bridget gripped her hat pin between her teeth, and lifted her arms to adjust her hat. She had sewn a new bunch of paper violets onto it, especially for the victory. She was standing at the top of the stairs, singing KKKD to herself. She was thinking of Clarence. When they were married in the spring, he said, although it had been before Christmas not so long ago, she would be leaving Fox Corner. She would have her own little household, her own babies. Staircases were very dangerous places, according to Sylvie. People died on them. Sylvie always told them not to play at the top of the stairs. Ursula crept along the carpet runner. Took a quiet breath and then, both hands out in front of her, as if trying to stop a train, she threw herself at the small of Bridget's back. Bridget whipped her head round, mouth and eyes wide in horror at the sight of Ursula. Bridget went flying, toppling down the stairs in a great flurry of arms and legs. Ursula only just managed to stop herself from following in her wake. Practice makes perfect. "The arm's broken, I'm afraid," Dr. Fellows said. "You took quite a tumble down those stairs." "She's always been a clumsy girl," Mrs. Glover said. "Someone pushed me," Bridget said. A great bruise bloomed on her forehead, she was holding her hat, the violets crushed. "Someone?" Sylvie echoed. "Who? Who would push you downstairs, Bridget?" She looked around the faces in the kitchen. "Teddy?" Teddy put his hand over his mouth as if he was trying to stop words escaping. Sylvie turned to Pamela. "Pamela." "Me?" Pamela said, piously holding both of her outraged hands over her heart like a martyr. Sylvie looked at Bridget, who made a little inclination of her head towards Ursula. Ursula. Sylvie frowned. Ursula stared blankly ahead, a conscientious objector about to be shot. Ursula, Sylvie said severely, do you know something about this? Ursula had done a wicked thing, she had pushed Bridget down the stairs. Bridget might have died, and she would have been a murderer now. All she knew was that she had to do it. The great sense of dread had come over her, and she had to do it. She ran out of the room and hid in one of Teddy's secret hiding places, the cupboard beneath the stairs. After a while the door opened and Teddy crept in, and sat on the floor next to her. I don't think you pushed Bridget, he said and slipped his small, warm hand into hers. Thank you. I did though. Well, I still love you. She might never have come out of that cupboard, but the front door bell clanged, and there was a sudden great commotion in the hallway. Teddy opened the door to see what was happening. He ducked back in and reported, Mummy's kissing a man. She's crying. He's crying as well. Ursula put her head out of the cupboard to witness this phenomenon. She turned in astonishment to Teddy. I think it might be Daddy, she said. Peace. February 1947. Ursula traversed the street cautiously. The road surface was treacherous, crimped and rucked by ridges and crevasses of ice. The pavements were even more perilous, no more than massifs of ugly, hard-packed snow, or, worse, toboggan runs ironed by the neighborhood children who had nothing better to do than enjoy themselves because the schools were closed. Oh God, Ursula thought, how mean-spirited I've become. The bloody war. The bloody peace. By the time she had put her key in the lock of the street door she was exhausted. A shopping trip had never seemed such a challenge previously, even in the worst days of the Blitz. The skin on her face was whipped raw by the biting wind, and her toes were numb with cold. The temperature hadn't risen above zero for weeks, colder even than 41. Ursula imagined at some future date trying to recall this glacial chill, and knew she would never be able to conjure it up. It was so physical, you expected bones to shatter, skin to crackle. Yesterday she had seen two men trying to open a manhole in the road with what looked like a flamethrower. Perhaps there would be no future of thaw and warmth, perhaps this was the beginning of a new ice age. First fire and then ice. It was as well, she thought, that the war had robbed her of any care for fashion. She was wearing, in order from inner to outer, a short-sleeved vest, a long-sleeved vest, a long-sleeved pullover, a cardigan, and stretched on top of it all her shabby old winter coat, bought new in Peter Robinson's 2 years before the war. Not to mention, of course, the usual drab underwear, a thick tweed skirt, grey wool stockings, gloves and mittens, a scarf, a hat, and her mother's old fur-lined boots. Pity any man who was suddenly moved to ravish her. Chance be a fine thing, eh? Enid Barker, one of the secretaries, said over the bomb and sucker of the tea urn. Enid had auditioned for the part of plucky young London woman somewhere around 1940, and had been playing it with gusto ever since. Ursula chided herself for more unkind thoughts. Enid was a good sort. Terrifically skilled at typing tabulations, something Ursula had never quite got the hang of when she was at secretarial college. She had done a typing and shorthand course, years ago now, everything before the war seemed like ancient history, her own. She had been surprisingly adept. Mr. Carver, the man who ran the secretarial college, had suggested that her shorthand was good enough for her to train as a court reporter at the Old Bailey. That would have been a quite different life, perhaps a better one. Of course, there was no way of knowing these things. She trudged up the unlit stairs to her flat. She lived on her own now. Millie had married an American U.S. Air Force officer, and moved to New York State, a war bride. Who'da thunk it? A thin layer of soot, and what seemed to be grease coated the walls of the stairway. It was an old building, in Soho of all places, needs must, she heard her mother's voice say. The woman who lived upstairs had a great many gentlemen callers, and Ursula had become accustomed to the creaking bedsprings and strange noises that came through the ceiling. She was pleasant though, always ready with a cheery greeting, and never missed her turn at sweeping the stairs. The building had been Dickensian in its dinginess to begin with, and was now even more neglected and unloved. But then, the whole of London looked wretched, grimy and grim. She remembered Miss Wolfe saying that she didn't think poor old London would ever be clean again. Everything is so awfully shabby. Perhaps she was right. You wouldn't think we had won the war, Jimmy said when he came to visit, spivvy in his American clothes, shiny and bright with promise. She readily forgave her little brother his New World élan. He had had a hard war. Hadn't they all? A long and hard war, Churchill had promised. How right he had been. It was a temporary billet. She had the money for something better, but the truth was she didn't really care. It was just one room, a window above the sink, a hot water geyser, shared toilet down the hall. Ursula still missed the old flat in Kensington that she had shared with Millie. They had been bombed out in the big raid of May 41. Ursula had thought of Bessie Smith singing like a fox without a hole, but she had actually moved back in for a few weeks, living without a roof. It was chilly, but she was a good camper. She had learned with the Bund Deutscher Madel, although it wasn't the kind of fact that you bandied about in those dark days. But here was a lovely surprise waiting for her. A gift from Pammy, a wooden crate filled with potatoes, leeks, onions, an enormous emerald green Savoy cabbage, a thing of beauty, and on the top, half a dozen eggs, nestled in cotton wool inside an old trilby of hues. Lovely eggs, brown and speckled, as precious as unpolished gemstones, tiny feathers stuck here and there. From Fox Corner, with love the label attached to the crate read. It was like receiving a Red Cross parcel. How on earth had it got here? There were no trains running, and Pamela was almost certainly snowed in. Even more puzzling was how her sister had managed to dig up this wintry harvest when earth stood hard as iron. When she opened the door, she found a scrap of paper on the floor. She had to put her spectacles on to read it. It was a note from Bea Shawcross. Visited but you weren't in. Will pop by again. Bea XXX. Ursula was sorry she had missed Bea's visit. It would have been a nicer way to spend a Saturday afternoon than wandering in the dystopian West End. She was immensely cheered by nothing more than the sight of a cabbage. But then the cabbage, unexpectedly as was always the wont of these moments, uprooted an unwanted memory of the little parcel in the cellar at Argyle Road, and she was plunged back into gloom. She was so up and down these days. Honestly, she chided herself, buck up, for heaven's sake. It felt even colder inside the flat. She had developed chilblains, horrid painful things. Even her ears were cold. She wished she had some earmuffs, or a balaclava, like the grey woolen ones that Teddy and Jimmy used to wear to school. There was a line in The Eve of St. Agnes, what was it? Something about the stone effigies in the church in icy hoods and mails. It used to make her feel cold every time she recited it. Ursula had learned the whole poem at school, a feat of memory that was probably beyond her now, and what, after all, had been the point if she couldn't even remember a complete line? She had a sudden longing for Sylvie's fur coat, a neglected mink, like a large friendly animal, that now belonged to Pamela. Sylvie had chosen death on VE Day. While other women were scratching together food for tea parties and dancing in the streets of Britain, Sylvie had lain down on the bed that had been Teddy's when he was a child and swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. No note. But her intention and motivation were quite clear to the family that she left behind. There had been a horrible funeral tea for her at Fox Corner. Pamela said it was the coward's way out, but Ursula wasn't so sure. She thought it showed a rather admirable clarity of purpose. Sylvie was another casualty of war, another statistic. You know, Pamela said, I used to argue with her because she said science had made the world a worse place, that it was all about men inventing new ways to kill people. But now I wonder if she wasn't right. And that was before Hiroshima, of course. Ursula lit the gas fire, a rather pathetic little radiant that looked as if it dated from the turn of the century, and fed the meter. The rumor was that pennies and shillings were running out. Ursula wondered why they couldn't melt down armaments, guns into plowshares, and so on. She unpacked Pammy's box, laying everything out on the little wooden draining board like a poor man's still life. The vegetables were dirty, but there wasn't much hope of washing the soil off as the pipes were frozen, even in the little ascot, although the gas pressure was so low that it could barely heat the water anyway. Water like a stone. At the bottom of the crate she found a half bottle of whiskey. Good old Pammy, ever the thoughtful one. She scooped some water from the bucket that she'd filled from the standpipe in the street, and put a pan of water on the gas ring, thinking she might boil one of the eggs, although it would take forever as there was only the tiniest frill of blue around the burner. There were warnings to be vigilant about the gas pressure, in case the gas came back on when the pilot light had gone out. Would it be so bad to be gassed, Ursula wondered. Gassed. She thought of Auschwitz. Treblinka. Jimmy had been a commando, and at the end of the war he had become attached, rather haphazardly according to him, although everything to do with Jimmy was always slightly haphazard, to the anti-tank regiment that liberated Bergen-Belsen. Ursula insisted that he told her what he had found there. He was reluctant and had probably withheld the worst, but it was necessary to know. One must bear witness. She heard Miss Wolfe's voice in her head, we must remember these people when we are safely in the future. The toll of the dead had been her business during the war, the endless stream of figures that represented the blitzed, and the bomb passed across her desk to be collated and recorded. They had seemed overwhelming, but the greater figures, the 6 million dead, the 50 million dead, the numberless infinities of souls, were in a realm beyond comprehension. Ursula had fetched water yesterday. They, who were they? After 6 years of war everyone had become accustomed to following their orders. What an obedient lot the English were. They had set up a standpipe in the next street, and Ursula had filled up a kettle and bucket from the tap. The woman ahead of her in the queue was terrifically smart in an enviable floor-length sable, silver grey, and yet there she was, waiting patiently in the bitter cold with her buckets. She looked out of place in Soho, but then who knew her story? The women at the well. Ursula seemed to remember that Jesus had a particularly confrontational conversation with the woman at the well. A woman of Samaria, no name, of course. She had had 5 husbands, Ursula recalled, and was living with a man who wasn't her husband, but the King James Bible never said what had happened to those 5. Perhaps she had poisoned the well. Ursula remembered Bridget telling them that when she was a girl in Ireland, she had walked to a well every day to draw water. So much for progress. How quickly civilization could dissolve into its more ugly elements. Look at the Germans, the most cultured and well-mannered of people, and yet. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. Given the same set of circumstances it could just as well have been the English, but that was something else you couldn't say. Miss Wolfe had believed that, she'd said. I say, the woman in sable said, interrupting her thoughts. Do you understand why my water is frozen solid and yet this isn't? She had a cut-glass accent. I don't know, Ursula said. I know nothing. The woman laughed and said, oh, I feel the same way, believe me, and Ursula thought that perhaps this was someone she would like as a friend, but then a woman behind them said, get a move on, love, and the Stableford woman hefted her buckets, as strapping as a land girl, and said, well, must be off, cheerio. She turned on the wireless. Transmission of the 3rd program had been suspended for the duration. The war against the weather. You were lucky if you got the home or the light, there were so many electricity cuts. She needed noise, the sound of a familiar life. Jimmy had given her his old gramophone before he left, hers had been lost in Kensington along, sadly, with most of her records. She had managed to rescue a couple, miraculously unbroken, and placed one on the turntable now. I'd rather be dead and buried in my grave. Ursula laughed. Cheerful or what, she said out loud. She listened to the scratch and hiss of the old record. Was that how she felt? She glanced at the clock, Sylvie's little gold carriage clock. She had brought it home after the funeral. 4 o'clock only. Ye gods, how the days dragged. She caught the pips, turned off the news. What was the point? She had spent the afternoon trawling Oxford Street and Regent Street, for something to do. Really it was just to get out of her monastic cell of a bedsit. All the shops were dim and dismal. Paraffin lamps in Swan and Edgar's, candles in Selfridge's, the drawn, shadowy faces of people like something from a painting by Goya. There was nothing to buy, or certainly nothing that she wanted, and anything she did want, like a lovely cozy-looking pair of fur-top boots, was outrageously expensive, 15 guineas. So depressing. Worse than the war, Miss Fawcett at work said. She was leaving to get married. They had all clubbed together for her wedding present, a rather uninspiring vase, but Ursula wanted to get her something more personal, more special, but she couldn't think what, and had hoped that the West End department stores might have just the thing. They didn't. She'd gone into a Lyons for a pale cup of tea, like lamb's water, Bridget would have said. And a utilitarian tea cake. She counted just 2 hard dry raisins, and a scraping of margarine, and tried to imagine she was eating something wonderful, a luscious cremaschnitt, or a slice of Dabostort. She supposed the Germans weren't getting much in the way of pastries at the moment. She murmured Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte accidentally out loud, such an extraordinary name, such an extraordinary cake, and attracted the unwanted attention of a neighboring table, a woman stoically working her way through a large iced bun. Refugee, love, she asked, surprising Ursula with her sympathetic tone. Something like that, Ursula said. While she was waiting for the egg to boil, the water still only lukewarm, she rooted among her books, never unpacked after Kensington. She found the Dante that Izzy had given her, nicely tooled red leather but the pages all foxed, a copy of Donne, her favorite, The Waste Land, a rare first edition purloined from Izzy, a collected Shakespeare, her beloved metaphysical poets, and finally, at the bottom of the box, her battered school copy of Keats, with an inscription that read to Ursula Todd, for good work. It would do for an epitaph too, she supposed. She flicked through the neglected pages until she found the Eve of St. Agnes. Ah, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold. She read out loud and the words made her shiver. She should read something warming, Keats and his bees, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Keats should have died on English soil. Asleep in an English garden on a summer's afternoon. Like Hugh. She ate the egg while reading a copy of yesterday's Times, given to her by Mr. Hobbs in the post room, when he had finished with it, a little daily ritual they had acquired. The paper's newly shrunk dimensions made it seem ridiculous somehow, as if the news itself was less important. Although really it was, wasn't it? Snow like flakes of grey, soapy ash was falling outside the window. She thought of the Coles relatives in Poland, rising above Auschwitz like a volcanic cloud, circling the earth and blotting out the sun. Even now, after everything people had learned about the camps and so on, anti-Semitism was still rife. Joboy, she'd heard someone being called yesterday, and when Miss Andrews ducked out of contributing to Miss Fawcett's wedding present, Enid Barker had made a joke of it and said, "What a Jew," as if it were the mildest of insults. The office was a tedious, rather irritable place these days, fatigue, probably, due to the cold and the lack of good, nourishing food. And the work was tedious, an endless compilation and permutation of statistics to be filed away in the archives somewhere, to be pored over by the historians of the future, she supposed. They were still clearing up and putting their house in order, as Maurice would have it, as if the casualties of war were clutter to be put away and forgotten. Civil defense had been stood down for over a year and a half, yet she still hadn't rid herself of the minutiae of bureaucracy. The mills of God, or the government, did indeed grind extremely small and slow. The egg was delicious, it tasted as if it had been laid that very morning. She found an old postcard, a picture of the Brighton Pavilion, bought on a day trip with Crichton, that she'd never sent, and scrawled a thank you to Pammy, wonderful. like a Red Cross package, and propped it up on the mantelpiece next to Sylvie's clock. Next to Teddy's photo too. Teddy and his Halifax crew taken one sunlit afternoon. They were lounging in an assortment of old chairs. Forever young. The dog, Lucky, stood as proud as a little figurehead on Teddy's knee. How cheering it would be to still have Lucky. She had Teddy's DFC, propped up on the glass of the photo frame. Ursula had a medal too, but it meant nothing to her. She would put the postcard in with the afternoon post tomorrow. It would take an age to reach Fox Corner, she supposed. 5 o'clock. She took her plate over to the sink to join the other unwashed dishes. The grey ash was a blizzard in the dark sky now, and she pulled the flimsy cotton curtain to try to make it disappear. It tugged hopelessly on its wire, and she gave up before she brought the whole thing down. The window was old and ill-fitting, and let in a piercing draft. The electricity went off and she fumbled for the candle on the mantelpiece. Could it get any worse? Ursula took the candle and the whiskey bottle to bed, climbed under the covers still in her coat. She was so tired. The flame on the little radiant fire quivered alarmingly. Would it be so very bad? To cease upon the midnight with no pain? There were worse ways. Auschwitz, Treblinka. Teddy's Halifax going down in flames. The only way to stop the tears was to keep drinking the whiskey. Good old Pammy. The flame on the radiant flickered and died. The pilot light too. She wondered when the gas would come back on. If the smell would wake her, if she would get up and relight it. She hadn't expected to die like a fox frozen in its den. Pammy would see the postcard, know that she'd been appreciated. Ursula closed her eyes. She felt as though she had been awake for 100 years and more. She really was so very, very tired. Darkness began to fall. Snow. February 11, 1910. Warm and milky and new, the smell was a siren call to Queenie the cat. Queenie, strictly speaking, belonged to Mrs. Glover, although she was aloofly unaware that she was anyone's possession. An enormous tortoiseshell, she had arrived on the doorstep with Mrs. Glover, carried in a carpet bag, and had taken up residence in her own Windsor chair, a smaller version of Mrs. Glover's, next to the big kitchen range. Having her own chair didn't stop her leaving her fur on every other available seat in the house, including the beds. Hugh, no great lover of cats, complained continually about the mysterious way that the mangy beast managed to deposit its hairs on his suits. More malevolent than most cats, she had a way of simply punching you, like a fighting hare, if you got close to her. Bridget, also no great cat lover, declared the cat to be possessed by a demon. Where was that delicious new scent coming from? Queenie padded up the stairs and into the big bedroom. The room was warmed by the embers of a hot fire. This was a good room, the thick, soft quilt on the bed and the gentle rhythms of sleeping bodies. And there a perfect little cat-sized bed, already warmed by a perfect little cat-sized cushion. Queenie kneaded her paws on the soft flesh, carried suddenly back to kittenhood. She settled herself down more comfortably, a deep bass purr of happiness rumbling in her throat. Sharp needles in the soft skin pricked her into consciousness. Pain was a new, unwelcome thing. But then suddenly she was muffled, her mouth full of something, stopping her, suffocating her. The more she tried to breathe, the less it became possible. She was pinned down, helpless, no breath. Falling, a bird shot. Queenie had already purred herself into a pleasant oblivion, when she was woken by a shriek, and found herself being grabbed and thrown across the room. Growling and spitting, she backed out of the door, sensing this was a fight she would lose. Nothing. Slack and still, the little ribcage not moving. Sylvie's own heart was knocking in her chest as if a fist was inside her, punching its way out. Such danger. Like a terrible thrill, a tide washing through her. Instinctively, she placed her mouth over the baby's face, covering the little mouth and nose. She blew gently. And again. And again. And the baby came back to life. It was that simple. I'm sure it was a coincidence, Dr. Fellows said, when told of this medical miracle. It seems very unlikely that you could revive someone using that method. Bridget returned to the kitchen from upstairs where she had been delivering beef tea, and reported faithfully to Mrs. Glover. Mrs. Todd says to tell cook, that's you, Mrs. Glover, that you have to get rid of the cat. That it would be better if you had it killed. Killed, Mrs. Glover said, outraged. The cat, now reinstated in her usual place by the stove, raised her head and stared balefully at Bridget. I'm just telling you what she said. Over my dead body, Mrs. Glover said. Mrs. Haddock sipped a glass of hot rum, in what she hoped was a ladylike way. It was her third, and she was beginning to glow from the inside out. She had been on her way to help deliver a baby when the snow had forced her to take refuge in the snug of the Blue Lion, outside Chalfont St. Peter. It was not the kind of place she would ever have considered entering, except out of necessity, but there was a roaring fire in the snug, and the company was proving surprisingly convivial. Horse brasses and copper jugs gleamed and twinkled. Visible from the snug on the other side of the counter was the public bar, where the drinks seemed to flow particularly freely. It was an altogether rowdier place. A sing-song was currently in progress there, and Mrs. Haddock was surprised to find her toe-tapping in accompaniment. You should see the snow, the landlord said, leaning across the great polished depth of the brass bar counter. We could all be stuck here for days. Days? You may as well have another tot of rum. You won't be going anywhere in a hurry tonight. Like a fox in a hole.